Chapter 2. New Kings and Kingdoms. Many new dynasties emerged after the 7th century. Map 1 shows the major ruling dynasties in different parts of the subcontinent between the 7th and 12th centuries. The emergence of new dynasties. By the 7th century, there were big landlords or warrior chiefs in different regions of the subcontinent. Existing kings often acknowledged them as their subordinates or samantas. They were expected to bring gifts for their kings or overlords, be present at their courts, and provide them with military support. As Samantas gained power and wealth, they declared themselves to be the Mahasamanta, Mahamandaleshwara, the great lord of a circle or region, and so on. Sometimes they asserted their independence from their overlords. One such instance was that of the Rashtrakutas in the Deccan. Initially, they were subordinate to the Chalukyas of Karnataka. In the mid 8th century, Dantidurga, a Rashtrakuta chief, overthrew his Chalukya overlord and performed a ritual called Hiranyagarbha, literally the golden womb. When this ritual was performed with the help of Brahmanas, it was thought to lead to the rebirth of the sacrificer as a Kshatriya, even if he was not one by birth. In other cases, men from enterprising families used their military skills to carve out kingdoms. For instance, the Kadamba Mayurashman and the Gurjara Pratihara Harichandra were Brahmanas who gave up their traditional professions and took to arms, successfully establishing kingdoms in Karnataka and Rajasthan respectively. Administration in the kingdoms. Many of these new kings adopted high sounding titles such as Maharaja Adhiraja, Great King, Overlord of Kings, Ti- Tribhuvana Chakravartin, Lord of the Three Worlds, and so on. However, in spite of such claims, they often shared power with their Samantas as well as with associations of peasants, traders, and Brahmanas. In each of these states, resources were obtained from the producers. That is, peasants, cattle keepers, artisans who were often persuaded or compelled to surrender part of what they produced. Sometimes these were claimed as rent due to a lord who asserted that he owned the land. Revenue was also collected from traders. These resources were used to finance the king's establishment as well as for the construction of temples and forts. They were also used to fight wars, which were in turn expected to lead to the acquisition of wealth in the form of plunder and access to land as well as trade routes. The functionaries for collecting revenue were generally recruited from influential families and positions were often hereditary. This was true about the army as well. In many cases, close relatives of the king held these positions. Prashastis and land grants. Prashastis contain details that may not be literally true, but they tell us how rulers wanted to depict themselves as valiant, victorious warriors. For example, these were composed by learned Brahmanas who occasionally helped in the administration. Kings often rewarded Brahmanas by grants of land. These were recorded on copper plates, which were given to those who received the land. Unusual for the 12th century was a long Sanskrit poem containing the history of kings and who ruled over Kashmir. It was composed by an author named Kalhana. He used a variety of sources, including inscriptions, documents, eyewitness accounts, and earlier histories, to write his account. Unlike the writer of Prashastis, he was often critical about rulers and their policies. Warfare for wealth. You may have noticed that each of these ruling dynasties was based in a specific region. At the same time, they tried to control other areas. One particularly prized area was the city of Kannauj in the Ganga Valley. For centuries, rulers belonging to the Pratihara, Rashtrakuta, and Pala dynasties fought for control over Kannauj because there were three parties in this long drawn conflict. Historians often describe it as the tripartite struggle. As we will see, page number 62 to 66. Rulers also tried to demonstrate their power and resources by building large temples. So, when they attacked one another's kingdoms, they often chose to target temples which were sometimes extremely rich. You will read more about this in chapter 5. One of the best known of such rulers is Sultan Muhammad of Ghazni, Afghanistan. He ruled from 997 to 1030 and extended control over parts of Central Asia, Iran, and northwestern part of the subcontinent. He raided the subcontinent almost every year. His targets were wealthy temples, including that of Somnath, Gujarat. Much of the wealth Muhammad carried away was used to create a splendid capital city at Ghazni. Sultan Muhammad was also interested in finding out more about the people he conquered and entrusted a scholar named Al-Biruni to write an account of the subcontinent. This Arabic work, known as the Kitab ul-Hind, remains an important source for historians. He consulted Sanskrit scholars to prepare this account. Other kings who engaged in warfare included the Charmanders, later known as the Chauhans, who ruled over the region around Delhi and Ajmer. They attempted to expand their control to the west and the east, where they were opposed by the Chalukyas of Gujarat and the Garhwalas of western Uttar Pradesh. The best known Chamana ruler was Prithviraj III, 1168 to 1192, who defeated an Afghan ruler named Sultan Muhammad Ghori in 1191, but lost to him the very next year in 1192. A closer look, the Cholas. From Urayur to Tanjore, how did the Cholas rise to power? A minor chiefly family known as the Muttarayar held power in the Kaveri Delta. They were subordinate to the Pallava kings of Kanchipuram. Vijayala, who belonged to the ancient chiefly family of the Cholas from Urayapur, captured the delta from the Muttarayar in the middle of the 9th century. He built the town of Tanjavur and a temple for goddess Nishambashudini there. The successor of Vijayala conquered neighboring regions and the kingdoms grew in size and power. The Pandyan and the Pallava territories to the south and north were made part of this kingdom. Rajaraja I, considered the most powerful Chola ruler, became king in 1985 and expanded control over most of these areas. He also reorganized the administration of the empire. Rajaraja's son Rajendra I continued his policies and even traded the Ganga Valley, Sri Lanka, and countries of Southeast Asia, developing a navy for these expeditions. Splendid temples and bronze sculptures. The big temples of Thanjavur and Gan- Gangaikonda Cholapuram, built by Raja Raja and Rajendra, are architectural and sculpture marvels. Chola temples often became the nuclei of settlements which grew around them. These were centers for of craft production. Temples were also endowed with land by rulers as well as by others. The produce of these land went into maintaining all the specialists who worked at the temple and very often lived near it. Priests, garland makers, cooks, sweepers, musicians, dancers, etc. In other words, the temples were not only places of worship, they were the hub of economic, social, and cultural life as well. Amongst the crafts associated with temples, the making of bronze images was the most distinctive. Chola bronze images were are considered amongst the finest in the world. While most images were of deities, sometimes images were made of devotees as well. Agriculture and irrigation. Many of the achievements of the Cholas were made possible through New developments in agriculture. Look at map 2 again. Notice that the river Kaveri branches off into several small channels before emptying into the Bay of Bengal. These channels overflow frequently, depositing fertile soil on their banks. Water from the channels also provides the necessary moisture for agriculture, particularly the cultivation of rice. Although agriculture had developed earlier, in other parts of Tamil Nadu. It was only from the 5th or 6th century that this area was opened up for large scale cultivation. Forest had to be cleared in some regions, land had to be leveled in other areas in the delta region, embankments had to be built to prevent flooding, and canals had to be constructed to carry water to the fields. In many areas, two crops were grown in a year. In many cases, it was necessary to water crops artificially. A variety of methods were used for irrigation. In some areas, wells were dug. In other places, huge tanks were constructed to collect rainwater. Remember that irrigation works require planning, organizing labor, and resources. Maintaining these works and deciding on how water is to be shared. Most of the new rulers, as well as people living in villages, took an active interest in these activities. The administration of the empire. How was the administration organized? Settlements of peasants known as would become prosperous with the spread of irrigation agriculture. Groups of such villages formed larger units called Nadu. The village council and the Nadu perform several administrative functions, including dispensing justice and collecting taxes. Rich peasants of the Velala caste exercised considerable control over the affairs of the Nadu under the supervision of the central Chola government. The Chola kings gave some rich landowners titles like Movent Villan, a villain or peasant serving three kings, Arayar, chief, etc., as markers of respect, and entrusted them with important offices of the state at the center. We have seen that Brahmanas often receive land grants or Brahmadaya. As a result, a large number of Brahmana settlements emerged in the Kaveri Valley as in other parts of South India. Each Brahmanaya was looked after by an assembly or sabha of prominent Brahmana landholders. These assemblies worked very efficiently. Their decisions were recorded in detail in inscriptions, often one on the stone walls of temples. Associations of traders known as nagarams also occasionally performed administrative functions in towns. Inscriptions from Uttaramerur in Chinglipur district, Tamil Nadu provide details of the way in which the Sabha was organized. The Sabha had separate committees to look after irrigation works, gardens, temples, etc. Names of those eligible to be members of these committees were written on small tickets of palm leaf. These tickets were put into an earthenware pot from which a young boy was asked to take out the tickets one by one for each committee.